Well, welcome everybody to our online program on addiction and recovery from the Sunshine Coast Health Center up here in Powell River, British Columbia. And we've been talking about cravings and particularly this controversy that has arisen in the new diagnostic criteria for addiction, in which they've now included cravings, and there's a big debate going on whether this was a good idea or not. Anyway, last time we talked about the idea of the biology of cravings. And this is the idea that somehow drugs sensitize a particular part of the brain, and that leads to these irresistible urges to use, regardless of whether the person actually wants to use them or not, or thinks it's a good idea. Okay? But as I mentioned, there's a great debate here, and some people really don't think that the biological argument is good enough. And there's a famous psychologist that just passed away a couple of years ago, Alan Marlatt. And Marlatt is probably the most famous researcher in relapse prevention. And towards the end of his career, he developed a technique for people to use, and he called it urge surfing. And he borrowed this idea from this thing called Mindfulness Meditation, if you've heard of it. It seems to be everywhere now. But the idea was that if the addict who is getting cravings could just realize, well, you know, thoughts and feelings just come and go, right? And that's just the way they are. And if you've actually paid attention to yourself, you'll know that this is quite real. Even a very famous philosopher, David Hume, figured this out centuries ago, that when he looked at himself, he realized that he would get these thoughts, and then they would just go away. And then he would get these feelings, and they would just go away. And this is what his daily life was like. Things would go into his consciousness, and then they would just flow out. And Marlatt made the argument, that's what cravings were. Cravings were like that. And that if people could just recognize that and accept that these cravings, yes, they'll come, that's fine, but then they'll just go, right? And not try to fight against them. And Marlatt always maintained that, well, if you fight against the craving, you sort of become your own worst enemy. Much better to just sort of sit back, be passive about it, and just allow these cravings to come in, because they're all time limited, they'll all just go away. And if they could get into that, then they could surf the urge, or urge surfing was the name of the technique, right? So that's an interesting one, much different than this biological definition of cravings, these biological theories that we talked about last time, right? Where rather than being just an irresistible compulsion to use due to this craving, Marlatt suggested, well, maybe not. Maybe we'll just let them come in and let them go out, and yeah, no big deal. Anyway, another view of cravings from a very famous psychologist. Anyway, we'll be back next time with another video.